Part 3, Dead Man's Corner. Chapter 18, Over the Continental Divide. After many long hours of travel, I arrived in Vernon, Texas, worn and sleepy. I boarded another train for Harold, where I spent the night with an uncle and his family. From him I borrowed a horse to visit the old home place, 15 miles south of Harold. My folks were no longer working the land, but were living outside Midland, Texas. I didn't spare horseflesh as I sped over the roads that I traveled so many years hence. The country really looked different to me. Where the horses had once stood, patches of weeds dotted the land here and there. Fences were either gone or in desperate condition. Windmills were silent and still. I knew then the old way was gone for me forever. The West had changed all the things I do. I drew in reins before the house of my childhood. I suddenly felt ashamed that I had stayed away for so long. I hadn't seen my folks in years. Lump after lump kept creeping up in my parched throat. A silent tear fell as I remembered I'd never had a chance to be a boy. Here I was again, after 16 years, staring at what represented my lost youth. I wondered what I'd lost by going, wondered what I would have gained by staying. Momentarily, I felt at peace with myself, forgetting the injuries I had suffered from my wanderlust. At least, after 12 years of age, I had never cost my family one penny. I went to the front door, but found it locked. Everything was quiet and still. The barn was falling, and the wheat granary was gone. I pried open a window and went in. Part of their household goods were still there. I looked through an old dresser and found a photograph of my dad. I decided then I would buy the place since Dad had it up for sale. I located the man Dad had left in charge and told him my plans, then headed to Midland to see the family. Before I left Dad and the family again, I promised I would try to settle down and roam no more. I sold Dad 2 sections of land in the Gaines County and all my cattle, which he had tended and leased 2 more sections to him. I borrowed 3 horses and a wagon and headed back for Wilbarger County. Before I knew it, I was facing something I knew very little about: farming. I set to work trying to fix the place up. I bought a new plow, tools, and mules and yellow corn. I bought 2 nice skits and a small flock of hens and a few cows and hired a man to help me once a month. I was just about as happy as a dead pig in the sunshine until one Saturday, some 6 months later, just as my corn was in silk and tassels, the wind blew a gale from the southwest so hot it almost burned my face. It blew that way on until Sunday. My beautiful corn turned white and tops turned down. My 20 acres of cotton wilted, and my oats where I had left the sow for long hours of hard labor in the field. My cotton made 1 lousy bale, and I made up about enough corn to fatten 4 hogs. I did raise 150 pullets that fall. I sowed 6 acres of wheat, and next spring I planted 40 in oats, and on that I made a complete failure. That summer I found myself without money and a bunch of hungry, poor-looking hogs. I asked myself over and over what possessed Byrd Cochrain to think he could make it farming. I had 6 head of cattle. It was dry, and stock water and grass were getting scarce, but cattle were fat in most pastures. I decided to buy cattle and sell them to market. I tried to buy a bunch of cattle from a man named Turnquest. He wouldn't take my check. Another heaping of coal was upon my head. I asked him to hold them for me. Then I went to the First National Bank in Electra and told Mr. Brown, the cashier, what I needed. I got the loan and bought the cattle. I got his son to help me with the cattle and get them in the stock pen. I billed them out to Cassidy Commission Company in Fort Worth and had the check payable to the Bank of Electra. The money beat me back to Electra. When I got home, Mr. Brown told me any time I found a bunch of cattle that I knew was worth money to buy them and check with him for the amount I needed. I shipped another carload of cattle I had on hand. From then on, I rode day and night, buying every head of cattle I could find that I could felt make some money on. I did at least to know a good cow when I saw one. I fattened and sold my hogs that fall, too. In January of 1912, I had a nice-sized bank account. I sold my teams and farming tools and leased all the grass I could get. I had 2 contracts for cattle to be delivered by April 1st. The contracts were for cows and yearling steers and 2-year-old steers. I was a busy man, but back at what I knew best. Most of my life I had spent thus far alone, or in the saddle, or herding cows, or looking for a place to build a campfire. Many times I would just sit watching its hot flickering light. By the campfire when the night came on, an old owl hooted. Coyotes howled in the awfullest way, and I would lie still and weave memories of the past and future. The life of a cowboy was a lonely one. The endless plains seemed to magnify their solitude and loneliness. On December 22nd, 1912, Miss Ethel Bay Hancock and I decided I had been alone far too long. I had never much given thought to getting married in those days. I didn't have time to court anyone for long, and I was no hand with the ladies. I never considered myself much of a catch, in spite of the teasings I used to get from the ladies in Dakota. But I met Ethel Bay one morning when she was coming out of church. She was 19 and beautiful. She was frail and sweet and fresh, and I loved her immediately. It was Ethel who had read my letters to Myrtle Ashley some years back. The Hancock family moved in with the Ashleys one fall to help pick cotton. Ethel was only a child then. The day I saw her in front of the little church, it never occurred to me that she would have me for a husband. I hardly knew how to approach her. I waited another week when I moved on from fear she might be offended if I lingered. I soon got a note from her asking me to her house. I courted my Ethel long enough, and then we were married, though it took some doing to get her mother's consent. I was a happy man, and had my wife, and I worked hard, and we loved being together. We stayed away from her family as much as possible, for we did not get along well at all. Most of the trouble arose when I refused to loan money to members of the Hancock family. In March 1914, I went to Fort Worth, Texas, to a fat stock show. When I was there, I met many old-time friends, Captain McBride being one of them. He had left Dakota too, and was in the field inspector for the Cattle Association. He encouraged me to join, and I did while we were still living outside Harold. Many unpleasant things had happened to my wife and me. We were destined to have only a few short lives together. When our baby boys started coming, she became ill and was hardly able to take care of them. I had to be away from the home quite a bit to make enough money to pay our doctor bills. The drug bills for Ethel were piling on me. Her brothers pestered her, telling they were going to kill me. They were usually drunk when they made such threats. I stayed away from them in order to keep her content. I had a family and wanted no trouble from anyone. In the month of February 1917, I received word from McBride about some land that could be bought in New Mexico. He told me about thieving and killing that was going on the New Mexico and Arizona border and over into Colorado. The rampant lawlessness New Mexico has experienced at the turn of the century was unequaled by any other state. McBride had recommended me for a special job, so rolling my 30-30 up in my bedding and stacking my saddle, I sent them to the depot and to be shipped. I kissed Ethel and our 4 baby boys goodbye. I told her I would send for her just as soon as I found us a home. I was eager to get away from her family since her health was failing, and their aggressiveness towards us wasn't helping her get well. Any change for us would be a happy change, I felt. I had another consideration. The climate and change of scenery might help my dear wife's failing health. I wanted so much to see her get well so we could have a full life together. I went to Denver to McBride's office. We shook a hand firmly, and he slapped me a good one on the back. We talked about the Dakotas for a spell, and then he had his secretary draw me a map for the place I was to go. He told me if I liked the land and wanted to buy, he felt he would help my wife's condition, for I had told him of her poor health. I promised him to do everything I could to get information on the rustlers who were being allowed to run wild in Socorro County. Socorro County, New Mexico, was a boiling focus of that generations-long struggle between native Mexican and transplanted Texan for control of the big state's eastern section. Local sheriffs, usually guided by politics, not justice, left the gate wide open for every kind of human refuse to drift in. It was not unusual for a man to surrender to the law for protection, then get shot in the back or turned over to the vigilantes gang. Wrestling had become a way of life on the frontier, and such habits were not easily broken. And since most communities had their legendary gunmen such as Blackjack Ketchum, Clay Allison, and others, Socorro had a man named El Fuego Baca, who became a legend in his own time and ruled the entire county with no questions asked. My instructions were to go to Jewett Forest Ranger Station, 18 miles east of the Oregon state line and 93 miles west of Magdalena. On a horse ranch, I bought two good saddle horses. I packed one and saddled the other, tied my pack horse to the saddle horse's train so I could have my hands free at all times, and the horses would have free access to the mountain trails and they could get used to the travel. Then I headed straight for Magdalena. I made no unnecessary stops on my way. I camped where I was when night crept upon me, provided the surroundings were favorable. In Magdalena, several people looked over my two fine horses with interest. The Red Roan was a fine saddler, and the Blood Bay was a stout build and showed strength and hardiness in every limb and muscle. I asked no question and answered none. I loaded my pack with provisions for myself and the horses, ate, and headed westward. I had been warned by McBride to mind my own business and to keep my ears open. The Jewett Ranger Station was 95 miles west of Magdalena. I knew from the way I'd been watching Magdalena that some sort of speculation would be going on about just who I was and what I was doing in New Mexico. All ranchers and cowmen knew in a short time when a stranger was riding through. It was an awfully aware of my situation, and I knew I got hamstrung in the godforsaken area. I need not call for official help. I passed near 3 ranches on my way to Magdalena to the ranger station. One of these ranches was a Mexican sheep ranch, and the other 2 owned by white men. The ground had about 8 inches of snow on it. I was in the middle of the Datil Plains, and it was bitter cold. There was not a thing but sagebrush to build a fire with. With the setting of the sun, I was many miles from snow-capped mountains. The weather was bad for my tired horses, but we had to keep moving or freeze to death. I gave them some grain and stopped long enough to eat. In less than an hour, I began to move towards my destination. By morning, I had struck the edge of the mountains. I selected a camping place, not knowing where I was, except that I was west of the Datil Plains, and there was no sign of life around me. About 4 the next evening, I came to the mountain trail that was been traveled by cattle since the snow had fallen. This trail was running north and south. I took the south direction, thinking I had traveled far enough to the west to be in the vicinity of the station. At the station, I was to talk to Ranger George R. Russell, for he and his crew were that time installing a phone line at the station on top of Fox Mountain, or Lookout Tower. I hadn't traveled southward far when the trail began to descend the mountainside. I could see a pretty valley below, dotted here and there with lofty pine trees. I could see a little mountain brook, and it wound through its way through the valley. Everything seemed to sparkle and glisten and gleam. And I was working my way around some large rocks that had rolled down on the slope, and suddenly I came face to face with a young woman riding a beautiful Spanish pony. Since both of us had made the curve at the same time, she was evidently quite startled. At the sight of my pack outfit, her pony took fright. It snorted and whirred back to the mountain. He either felt his rider lose his balance or decided he had to move alone, for he downed his head and arched his back like a tomcat. He tucked his tail and bucked with all his might, all the time bawling like a yearling calf. The young girl left her saddle in a second jump. Her left foot slipped through her stirrup, and she held the bridle reins, and the horse dragging her and kicking at her all the time. I saw that I would have to save her life by shooting the horse. Quick as a flash, I sent forth a deadly missile from the handsome Spanish pony and fell to the ground, quivering in death. I had sent the bullet in his neck, breaking it just behind his ears. I loosened her foot from the stirrup and dragged her from the reach of the dying horse's hooves. Her eyes were closed and blood was streaming from an ugly wound on her head, which had struck a projecting rock, knocking her senseless. I examined her wound and was relieved that she was not badly hurt. Her pretty, childish face was almost as white as the snow upon which she lay. I rolled up my bed and scraped the snow from beneath a big juniper tree and gently laid her on it. I took off her coat and shoes and put her frail body between the covers. I kindled a fire and soon had some water warm, tamed from the melting snow in the frying pan. I washed her face and bound the cut. I rode down the mountain into the valley below. After 3 or 4 miles and finding nothing, I turned back to camp. The girl was still asleep, so I tried again. I looked for a house or some sign of life to no avail. After feeding my horses and hobbling them out through the night, I prepared my supper, ate, then carried wood to build fire through the night. The girl talked all night in her sleep, but she was talking in Spanish, and I couldn't understand her. The wolves smelled the blood of the dead horse and kept at a constant howl all night, making sleepless hours more miserable for me. The next morning, as I was eating my breakfast, I saw the tarpaulin raise slowly, and two shining dark eyes beneath it looked out at me in fright. I tipped my hat to her and smiled and motioned to her to eat with me. Quickly, the tarp dropped. I walked over to her and laughed as she hid her tiny face from me. I spoke kindly and offered my hand. I left her alone for a while, and she idled up beside me to be closer to the fire. I motioned for her to sit and eat. She ate sparingly and with a great deal of embarrassment, since we were both strangers. After I cleared away the dishes, I took her saddle from the dead horse and put it on my pack horse, and motioned for her to take the lead of my horse. I left my outfit behind. After hours of riding, we drew rein for a prosperous-looking house with a large barn and tall stacks of oats nearby. She dismounted and motioned for me to do the same. She called to a boy who was in the barnyard to come for the horses, then she motioned me towards the house. Her mother met us at the door. She was a beautiful middle-aged woman, tall and slender, with black hairs and eyes. She had flawless white skin and fine features. The family was apparently well-to-do. She hardly noticed me as she embraced her daughter, speaking rapidly to her in Spanish. I realized the girl was explaining to her mother what had happened to her. Her mother offered me her hand and pulled me into the house, offering me a big chair. She and her daughter left the room for a while. Shortly, I was dozing in the chair. Between those moments of consciousness and unconscious sleep, I could hear the crackling of heavy logs in an open fireplace. The footfall of heavy steps roused me from my sleep. The door opened, and a dark, heavy-set Mexican stood before me, offering his hand in a friendly gesture. I introduced myself. "Welcome to my ranch, friend," he said in a fairly good English. His name was Fidel Armijo. He assured me that his lasting friendship. He then told me his wife's mother, Candelaria Chavez. Chavez was mounted police in the area, and Fidel Armijo was sheep and cattle inspector. Unknown to me then, these two would soon take my side in one of the hottest gun battles I was ever in. Soon after dinner, I rode back to the trail the girl and I had left that morning. I reached my camp and packed the journey until 9 that night. When I drew rein before the Hewitt Ranger Station, which had been my destination all along, I called out, my voice echoing through the chill of the night. A friendly voice answered, "Hello there!" I saw a light in the window from the neat 3-room structure which served as headquarters and living area of the head ranger. George D. Russell helped me put my horses up for the night, then he took me into his kitchen and set a plate before me. He and I talked about the country and the possibilities of one buying a small ranch. He told me he had moved there from Big Bend County from southwest Texas only 3 months before. He didn't know much about the area. He was a native of Texas in every respect. Ranger Russer had left the ranger station for another assignment before I returned to Texas. He had 2 brothers, Billy and Barry, who were also forest rangers. Barry was a fire guard in a nearby district. When war broke out, Billy and Barry and another brother, Benny, volunteered, but the Forest Service asked Mr. Russell to stay as he was badly needed. I told Mr. Russell I wanted to settle somewhere near the ranger station if I could find a place. He gave me all the information he could. He told me of a Mexican who had a ranch which adjoined the pasture near the west. This ranch had a permit for 200 head of cattle to be run upon by the Forest Reserve, and that was about all I could handle. It had no cattle on at the time. Well, he went with me to inspect the property. Later he surveyed it for me without charge. He refused to pay, so I went to Magdalena one day and bought him a new hat. The next morning I arrived at the station. Mr. Russell and I stood in a large sandstone, which was at the base of a hill, rather high sandstone ridge that projected to the valley from the mountain that towered above us on the west. From this spot we had a good view of the valley and surrounding mountains. We could see the noted NH Ranch on the east side extending to the north. We could also see the ranger station in the center of the valley, and the Correjo Ranch on the west side extending into the mountains. There I saw 2 log cabins owned by the Correjo family. Mr. Russell told me that Mrs. Nellie Whiskers Correjo, widow, owned the 2 cabins, and that she might sell part of her land to me. Mrs. Correjo was a full-blood Irish, and she had married a Mexican when she was a young girl living in a mining camp in southeastern Arizona. She had lost her husband, so loading up her 3 sons, Juan, Henry, and Ambrosia, and what belongings had, they headed for New Mexico. When she saw the beautiful Queen's Head, she said, "Boys, at the foot of this mountain we will build our home." And that is what they did. She worked as hard as any man. The boys rode around and found water for little Aurora for a few miles away. They hauled water until they could dig a well. They cut and prepared logs for a small cabin. All their supplies had to be brought by wagon, and the nearest village was Aragon, 6 miles through the rugged mountains. The two cabins were built not far from each other. George Russell talked to Mrs. Crahill about me for the land. I saw a horseman leave the NH ranch. Mr. Russell focused on the field glasses on him and told me it was Clay C. Cooper. I had heard of him, but made no mention of the fact. Mr. Russell told me Cooper was the owner of the NH Ranch and that he started the reserve, a little town on the Blue River, 45 miles from here. He had a horse race to match with some man from Roswell the next day. There was to be turkey shooting, bronc riding, and roping, and other contests held in honor of Washington's birthday on February 22nd. I decided to overtake Cooper before he entered the Mexican town that night. Mr. Clay C. Cooper was not only a noted race rider in that part of the country, but he was also a gambler and the leader of a band of cattle rustlers and horse thieves. Law enforcement was so poor in that area that no one had ever been able to prosecute Cooper. Cooper himself was a deputy and a game warden. He had El Fuego Baca, who, among other things, was his lawyer, hired by him to defend him or any one of his 3 boys who got in trouble. Cooper was also known as Boogerface, though no one dared call that to him within hearing distance. It seems the old fellow was caught in cards one night at the reserve and got his face cut up, leaving an ugly scar. He had surely been given a good handle. In earlier days, Reserve, New Mexico, was known as Frisco. There was Lower Frisco and Upper Frisco. Mr. Russell told me that Cooper had once tried to involve him in a game law violation. He said, but I got an arrest on him and he sent him to jail in the county seat for a few days before we could make bond. I ran Copper's hogs out of the corn patch, and he came running at me with a rifle to the quarrel. I didn't back down, no siree. I sent him back the same kind of argument. I told him I'd kill his blankety-blank hogs if he didn't keep them up. And that's about all the trouble I've had with him. But he's a mean one. Soon I left Mr. Russell to overtake Boogerface Cooper.